Picture the one moment in your entire day you consider completely, non-negotiably private. Not your bedroom, not your phone. The bathroom, alone, door locked, nobody watching, nobody talking to you. Now imagine that exact moment, except 20 strangers are sitting directly beside you, watching, chatting, waiting their turn. No walls between you, no stalls, no doors, just a long stone bench, and every single person using it at once. That was not a nightmare. That was an ordinary Tuesday in ancient Rome, and it happened to almost everyone alive. This is not a story about how people once hid from each other. It is a story about who got to hide at all and who was never given the choice. This is the story of privacy's strangest blind spot, the one modern people almost never think to question directly. Start with the physical space itself, because it looked nothing like anything you would recognize as a restroom today. Romans called it the forica, a public latrine built starting around the 2nd century BCE, often attached to public baths. It was, structurally, one single room. No partitions, no dividing walls, no doors separating one person from the next. Stone or wooden benches ran along the exterior walls, with evenly spaced holes cut directly into the seating surface. Beneath those benches ran a continuous channel of flowing water, usually recycled directly from the neighboring bathhouse. That water carried waste away constantly, an efficient plumbing system built centuries before most of Europe managed anything similar. But efficient plumbing was never the strange part of this story. The seating arrangement was the strange part. People sat shoulder to shoulder, facing each other directly across the room, doing exactly what you assume they were doing, and they did it while talking, casually, about business, about gossip, about whatever Romans normally discussed in public. The Roman poet Martial, writing centuries ago, left behind a complaint that still reads as remarkably uncomfortably relatable. He grumbled that a particular acquaintance read poetry aloud to him constantly, in every possible circumstance, without exception, standing, sitting, running, and, in his own specific wording, even while Martial was using the forica itself. Read that again. A friend reciting poetry, uninvited, while Martial sat on a public latrine bench beside dozens of strangers. That detail alone should completely reframe how you imagine daily life in one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. This was not an embarrassing secret Romans quietly endured. It was simply how the activity worked for almost everyone. The forica functioned as something closer to a social hub than a private necessity, and Romans treated it that way openly. People lingered there. They discussed trade deals. They caught up on neighborhood news. They made plans for the evening ahead. For laborers, merchants, and enslaved people specifically, the public forica was frequently the only bathroom option available at all. There was no private alternative waiting at home for most of the population living inside a bustling Roman city. Now add one more detail that tends to catch modern audiences completely off guard every single time it comes up. Toilet paper, as you understand it, simply did not exist yet, anywhere in the Roman world. Instead, Romans used something called a tersorium, a natural sea sponge attached firmly to the end of a wooden stick. After use, the sponge was rinsed in a shallow channel of flowing water, positioned directly in front of the bench. And in many public latrines, that same sponge-tipped stick was shared, used repeatedly, by whoever needed it next. Modern hygiene standards did not exist yet, and neither did the individualized disposable products people take entirely for granted today. This detail is not included here purely for shock value, although it certainly lands that way on first hearing it. It is included because it reveals something deeper about how differently ancient societies understood the boundary of personal space. The line separating your body's most private functions from communal, shared experience simply sat somewhere else entirely. Sit with that idea directly, because it complicates almost everything modern life assumes about basic human dignity and privacy. You likely consider a locked bathroom door to be a fundamental, obvious right, not a privilege requiring justification. For most of Roman history, and for most people living inside that empire, that specific right simply did not exist. Now, here is the detail that turns this story from a strange historical footnote into something closer to a pointed social critique. Private toilets did exist in ancient Rome. They were called a latrina, and they were absolutely not available to everyone. Latrina were built inside the homes and villas belonging specifically to Rome's wealthiest citizens, as private, individual facilities. Rather than connecting to the city's shared sewage channels, these private latrines typically emptied into a dedicated cesspit below the house. Owning a latrina meant something specific and socially loaded. You had enough wealth and status to purchase solitude itself. Privacy, in this particular and very literal sense, was not a universal human right extended equally to every Roman citizen. It was a commodity, priced beyond the reach of laborers, merchants, and the enslaved population who built and served that same empire. This reframes the entire question posed at the very beginning of this video in a way worth sitting with directly. The thing you consider your most basic, non-negotiable form of privacy was, for most of Roman history, a luxury good, available only to people wealthy enough to build a private room around one of the most ordinary human functions imaginable. The forica was never an isolated Roman oddity, sitting alone as some strange exception in an otherwise modest ancient world. It existed alongside an even larger institution built around the same basic principle, the Roman public bath, the thermae. Romans of nearly every social class bathed together, communally, in enormous shared pools, often multiple times throughout a single week. Nudity in that specific context carried none of the intense, automatic shame modern culture typically attaches to public exposure. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, depending on the era and specific location, though mixed bathing did occur at various points historically. Bathhouses functioned as genuine social centers. People exercised, debated philosophy, negotiated business deals, and relaxed, all within the very same space. Privacy in that specific setting was never the goal anyone was pursuing. Community, visibility, and shared leisure were the actual point. This pattern was not confined to Rome alone, and it did not disappear once the Roman Empire itself eventually collapsed. Centuries later, medieval European bathhouses continued a remarkably similar tradition, often mixed-gender, communal, and largely unbothered by modern-style modesty. Public bathing gradually declined across much of Europe during later centuries, partly due to plague fears and shifting religious attitudes. Meanwhile, in Japan, communal bathing culture developed along an entirely separate historical path, producing something called the onsen and the sento. Public bathhouses in Japan have operated continuously for centuries, and many remain genuinely communal, nude, and largely unbothered by Western-style privacy norms even now. In the Ottoman world, elaborate public bathhouses called hammams served an almost identical social function. Cleansing combined directly with open community gathering. Different empires, different centuries, different religions and languages entirely, yet the same underlying logic kept reappearing across each one independently. Bodily privacy was consistently treated as negotiable, culturally specific, and frequently secondary to the practical social benefits of shared communal space. Now consider an intriguing counterexample. Because history rarely moves in one single uniform direction across every civilization simultaneously. Thousands of years before Rome existed, the Indus Valley civilization built cities with something surprisingly advanced: individual, private household toilets. Archaeologists excavating Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan uncovered sophisticated drainage systems connecting private latrines directly to covered city sewers. This means one of the world's very first sophisticated urban civilizations valued individual bodily privacy far earlier than the Romans, who followed much later. Privacy, in other words, did not simply improve steadily over time as civilizations supposedly grew more advanced or more modern. It fluctuated considerably, appearing strongly in some ancient societies, and nearly vanishing entirely in other equally sophisticated ones nearby or afterward. This complicates any simple story claiming humanity marched steadily forward from primitive exposure toward increasingly refined, universal modern privacy standards. The real pattern looks messier, more inconsistent, and far more dependent on specific engineering, culture, religion, and class structure at any given moment. Now bring this story back toward the present, because communal, unwalled bathroom experiences never actually vanished completely from modern life either. Military basic training famously includes open bay showers and toilets, stripped deliberately of individual privacy as part of a broader institutional design. School locker rooms, gym facilities, and certain festival portable toilet setups continue to replicate versions of this same reduced privacy experience today. Camping trips, refugee shelters, and emergency housing situations frequently force modern people back into circumstances startlingly similar to ancient communal facilities. The discomfort people report in these modern situations often mirrors, almost exactly, the exposure ancient Romans simply treated as an unremarkable daily routine. This suggests privacy expectations are learned, reinforced, and culturally maintained, rather than fixed permanently into human psychology from birth onward. Developmental psychologists note that modesty around bodily functions is not present at birth, and instead develops gradually through direct cultural instruction. Young children show little natural instinct toward private bathroom behavior until parents, teachers, and surrounding culture actively, repeatedly teach them otherwise. By adulthood, that learned instinct feels entirely natural, permanent, and biologically hardwired, even though its origins are almost entirely cultural and historical. Historians studying privacy note that intensified, individualized bodily modesty expanded considerably during the 18th and 19th centuries across parts of Europe. Rising wealth, new plumbing technology, and shifting religious and social attitudes combined to gradually push bodily functions further behind closed, private doors. The Victorian era in particular is frequently cited as a turning point, when public discussion of bodily functions became something newly considered improper. Before that shift, for centuries and across multiple civilizations, communal exposure had simply been the ordinary, unremarkable baseline most people quietly accepted. Understanding that timeline changes how the entire question posed at the start of this video should actually be answered directly. Ancient humans did not lack privacy because they were unsophisticated, primitive, or somehow incapable of building walls and doors when they wanted to. They lacked a specific cultural expectation that modern audiences now assume must have always existed, everywhere, as an unquestionable universal constant. That expectation is comparatively recent, unevenly distributed even today, and closely tied to wealth, plumbing infrastructure, and specific cultural history. Now widen the lens beyond Rome specifically, because this pattern repeats itself with startling consistency across other ancient civilizations too. Communal bathing and communal toilet facilities appear across numerous cultures, spanning multiple continents and thousands of years of recorded history. The specific architecture changed from place to place, but the underlying social logic frequently stayed remarkably strikingly similar. Bodily functions were treated as ordinary, unremarkable shared experiences, rather than something requiring dedicated architectural concealment by default. Modern discomfort with this idea says less about ancient people and considerably more about how recently modern privacy norms actually developed. The locked, single-occupancy bathroom stall, now considered an absolute baseline expectation, is a surprisingly recent architectural convention historically speaking. Even into the 19th and early 20th centuries, many public facilities in rapidly industrializing cities remained heavily communal by modern standards. Individual privacy, at this specific bodily level, expanded gradually alongside plumbing technology, urban wealth, and shifting cultural expectations over time. It did not arrive as a single dramatic invention. It arrived slowly, unevenly, tracking closely alongside who could actually afford it. Consider one more specific piece of engineering that made all of this communal plumbing possible in the first place. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest large-scale sewer systems, ran directly beneath the city of Rome itself. Originally built to drain marshland, it was later expanded to carry wastewater away from public latrines and bathhouses continuously. Some sections of that ancient sewer system remained functional for well over 2,000 years, an engineering feat rarely appreciated today. Without it, the entire communal forica system simply could not have functioned at the scale Roman cities actually required. Privacy, in this story, was never purely a matter of culture or personal preference floating independently above practical circumstances. It was constrained directly by available engineering, and expanded only once plumbing technology made individual facilities practically affordable. Now consider a strange modern psychological condition that likely could not have existed inside Roman social context at all. It is sometimes called Paruresis, or informally, shy bladder syndrome. Genuine difficulty urinating specifically when other people are nearby. Modern researchers estimate it affects a meaningful percentage of the population, particularly in cultures with intensely individualized bathroom privacy norms. The condition depends entirely on a specific cultural expectation that bodily functions require solitude in order to feel psychologically safe. Remove that cultural expectation entirely, the way Roman society effectively did, and the specific anxiety attached to it likely weakens considerably. This does not mean modern privacy norms are wrong, or that ancient Romans were somehow psychologically healthier by comparison. It means privacy, and the anxieties surrounding its absence are constructed together, shaped jointly by culture, architecture, and shared expectation. A Roman citizen was never taught to feel that specific vulnerability, because the surrounding culture never established it as something worth fearing. A modern person absorbs that vulnerability early, reinforced constantly by locked doors, individual stalls, and near-universal cultural agreement on the matter. Neither response is more natural than the other in any absolute biological sense worth defending as universally correct. Both are learned responses to two very different built environments, separated by roughly 2,000 years of shifting technology and custom. This detail matters for reasons extending well beyond simple historical curiosity about ancient Roman bathroom habits specifically. It suggests that many anxieties modern people experience as fixed, permanent, and deeply personal are considerably more negotiable than they initially feel. Cultures can, and repeatedly have, drawn the line of bodily privacy in dramatically different places across different eras entirely. None of those specific placements were arbitrary accidents, and none of them were absolute, universal truths handed down from nature itself. They were negotiated, slowly, through engineering capability, religious belief, economic class, and gradually shifting collective expectation over many centuries. Understanding that negotiation does not eliminate modern discomfort with communal exposure, and it is not really meant to accomplish that goal. It simply offers useful context. Your specific comfort zone was built by circumstance, not discovered as some permanent law of human nature. Someone living 2,000 years from now may find your own bathroom habits just as puzzling as Roman habits feel to you. They may wonder why an entire civilization insisted on solitary confinement for something so completely ordinary and universally shared among every human being. They may find modern paruresis just as culturally specific and strange as modern audiences currently find Marshall's poetry-reading dinner companion. That thought alone is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes privacy as an ongoing negotiation rather than a fixed, finished achievement. Every generation redraws this particular line slightly differently, influenced by whatever technology, wealth, and belief system happens to surround them. Rome drew it one way. The Indus Valley drew it differently, and considerably earlier. Modern industrialized nations drew it yet again. There is no final, correct version of that line, waiting to be discovered once history simply finishes progressing toward it. There is only the version currently surrounding you, shaped by plumbing, wealth, and custom, exactly the way Rome's version once was. Now return to that opening image one more time. 20 strangers, one open room, no walls, casual conversation continuing throughout. Try to imagine your own reaction, transported directly into that exact scene, without any modern context to soften the shock. Discomfort, most likely. Possibly genuine embarrassment, the kind that feels instinctive rather than culturally taught or consciously chosen. But that instinct itself is worth examining honestly, because it is far more culturally conditioned than it initially feels from the inside. A Roman citizen using the forica likely felt no comparable embarrassment whatsoever, because the entire cultural framework around the activity differed completely. Shame, in this specific context, was not a fixed biological constant hardwired identically into every human being across history. It was calibrated, differently, by the surrounding culture, the available architecture, and the social norms absorbed gradually since early childhood. Change the architecture, and the emotional experience attached to an identical biological act can shift dramatically, sometimes almost completely. This does not mean privacy itself is a meaningless, entirely arbitrary modern invention with no deeper significance whatsoever. It means the specific form privacy takes, room by room, function by function, has always been culturally negotiable and historically variable. Bodily privacy, emotional privacy, spatial privacy, each one developed on its own separate, sometimes wildly inconsistent historical timeline. Ancient Rome protected certain kinds of privacy fiercely, particularly around wealth, political scheming, and elite social status among the upper class. It protected almost none of the bodily privacy modern people now consider automatic, obvious, and entirely beyond serious question. That specific inconsistency reveals something important about privacy as a concept, something easy to overlook entirely in modern daily life. Privacy was never one single unified idea, expanding steadily and uniformly across all of human history in lockstep progression. It was, and remains, a patchwork, fiercely guarded in some very specific areas and almost completely absent in certain others. Modern life inherited an unusually dense, comprehensive version of that patchwork, layered thickly across nearly every conceivable aspect of daily existence. A locked bathroom, a private bedroom, individual devices, individual passwords, individual accounts, guarding even minor personal preferences and browsing habits. None of that density existed for the vast majority of people who ever lived across the full span of human history. It is entirely reasonable and arguably overdue to feel genuine gratitude for the specific privacy you now casually take for granted. It is equally worth remembering that this exact privilege remains, even today, distributed unevenly across different regions, classes, and economic circumstances. Millions of people today still lack reliable, safe, private sanitation facilities, a fact easy to forget inside a wealthy, plumbed household. The Roman forica, in that specific sense, has not entirely disappeared from the modern world. It has only shifted location. Somewhere, right now, someone is using a shared, unwalled, distinctly public facility, exactly the way Romans once did, without a second thought. The specific century changed considerably. The underlying inequality behind who gets true privacy and who does not, disturbingly, has not changed nearly as much. Consider one final time that stone bench beside the flowing channel of ancient Roman water, and the crowd casually seated along it. They were not primitive, embarrassed, or somehow less sophisticated than you for lacking modern privacy standards you currently take entirely for granted. They simply lived inside a different, equally coherent social agreement about where the boundary of private experience actually belonged. Your version of that boundary is not more natural, more correct, or more permanent than theirs ever was. It is simply the specific version your particular century, your particular culture, and your particular income happen to inherit by circumstance. Someday, someone may look back at your own bathroom door, locked out of habit, and find that detail just as revealing. Not because privacy is fake or unimportant or purely arbitrary in every possible sense worth taking seriously. Because privacy, in every single era humans have ever lived through, has always been drawn along remarkably specific telling lines. And those lines reveal, more clearly than almost anything else in the historical record, exactly who a society valued and how much.